NATO versus Russia. Could this be the spark for World War III? Tensions between NATO and Russia have been dangerously high since the start of the Ukraine war, but what happens if the conflict escalates beyond Ukraine's borders? A full-scale war between NATO and Russia could be the most devastating conflict since World War II, potentially even turning nuclear. How could this scenario unfold, and what would be the possible outcomes? Stage 1. Escalation in Ukraine or the Baltic states. Despite heavy losses, Russia continues its war in Ukraine, and the possibility of escalation remains high. There are several ways the conflict could spiral out of control. 1. Direct Russian attack on NATO territory. If a Russian missile or drone mistakenly, or deliberately, strikes a NATO country like Poland, Romania, or the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, it could trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, where an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. A full-scale NATO response could then lead to direct war between Russia and the West. 2. Russian military expansion beyond Ukraine. If Russia achieves military success in Ukraine, Putin could feel emboldened to test NATO's resolve elsewhere, such as Moldova, which has a pro-Russian breakaway region, Transnistria. The Baltic states, which have Russian-speaking minorities that Russia could claim to be protecting. Finland or Sweden, now part of NATO, could become targets of Russian hybrid warfare. 3. Ukraine strikes inside Russia. If Ukraine, with Western weapons, launches deeper attacks into Russian territory, Moscow might escalate the war. This could include missile strikes on Kyiv, attempts to assassinate Ukrainian leaders, or cyber attacks on Western infrastructure. Stage 2. Hybrid warfare and nuclear threats. If NATO and Russia move toward direct conflict, the initial phase wouldn't necessarily involve tanks rolling across Europe. Instead, both sides would first engage in hybrid warfare, a mix of cyber attacks, economic sabotage, and psychological operations. Cyber and economic warfare. Russia could hack NATO's power grids, financial institutions, and military networks, aiming to cause chaos without firing a shot. NATO could cripple Russia's economy through extreme sanctions, cutting off oil and gas exports completely. Russia might weaponize migration, pushing large waves of refugees into Europe to destabilize governments. The nuclear threat becomes real. Putin has repeatedly threatened nuclear weapons if Russia faces an existential threat. This could start with tactical nuclear weapons, small-scale nukes used on the battlefield to intimidate NATO. The West would then have to decide: respond with nuclear weapons or escalate conventionally. This is where the world would be on the brink of catastrophe. A single miscalculation could lead to a global nuclear war. Stage 3. Possible direct NATO intervention. At this stage, NATO would be forced to act. There are several ways this could play out. Scenario 1. NATO strikes back, but avoids all-out war. NATO might launch airstrikes on Russian forces in Ukraine while avoiding direct attacks inside Russia. This could push Russia to retreat but might also provoke further escalation. A prolonged, high-tech war with no clear winner could devastate Europe. Scenario 2. Full-scale war in Eastern Europe. If Russia attacks a NATO country, e.g., Poland or the Baltics, NATO mobilizes fully, sending troops into battle. A modern war between Russia and NATO would involve massive air and missile strikes on military bases. Tank battles in Eastern Europe, possibly in Poland and the Baltics. Naval blockades, cutting off Russian supply lines. This could drag on for years, reshaping the world order entirely. Scenario 3. Nuclear Armageddon. If Russia begins losing a conventional war, Putin could use tactical nuclear weapons to force NATO to back down. NATO would then face a terrifying choice: use its own nuclear weapons in retaliation. Negotiate for peace, but at what cost? If full-scale nuclear war erupts, major cities across the world, Washington, Moscow, London, Berlin, could be wiped out within hours. This would be the end of modern civilization as we know it. Possible outcomes. What happens next? 1. Frozen conflict and stalemate. After some initial fighting, NATO and Russia agree to a ceasefire, similar to North and South Korea. Ukraine might be permanently divided, with Russia keeping some territory but facing long-term sanctions. Tensions would remain, but nuclear war would be avoided. 2. Long, costly war in Europe. If no side backs down, the war could drag on for years, similar to World War I or Afghanistan. Millions could die, and Europe's economy could collapse. Eventually, exhaustion might force both sides to negotiate a fragile peace. 3. Nuclear apocalypse. If diplomatic efforts fail and nuclear weapons are used, civilization as we know it could end. Even a limited nuclear exchange could kill hundreds of millions. A global nuclear winter could follow, leading to mass starvation and economic collapse worldwide. Final thoughts. Can this war be avoided? A NATO-Russia war would be the most dangerous conflict in human history. Even if nuclear weapons aren't used, the economic and humanitarian toll would be catastrophic. That's why diplomacy, military deterrence, and avoiding miscalculation are absolutely crucial. The question remains, will global leaders find a way to de-escalate, or are we heading toward an unavoidable catastrophe?